The Tall Whites' secret agenda exposed. In 1965, Airman Charles Hall was assigned to a remote desert facility in Nevada. He wasn't supposed to find life, only weather. Instead, he found them, 7 to 9 foot beings, chalk white, luminous, and completely silent. They weren't invaders. They were residents. And for 2 years, he watched the US military treat them like honored guests. This is the story the government never declassified. The hidden alliance between the US Air Force and the Tall Whites, the technology they traded, and the secret agenda that's still unfolding beneath Nevada's sands. The moment everything changed. The desert air was still when the radio stopped crackling. Charles Hall stood alone outside his weather shack, a few miles beyond the farthest light of Nellis Air Force Base. He adjusted the dial, expecting static to fade in, but instead, everything went silent. The night was so quiet that even the sand seemed to listen. Then, something shimmered on the dunes. A white glow, too tall to be a man, shifted across the ridge line watching. Hall froze. He'd been cleared for weather observations, not whatever this was. He gripped his clipboard, trying to rationalize it. Mirage, headlights, maybe a flare. But the glow moved in slow, measured steps, and the air around it bent like heat waves. The silence deepened, pressing in his ears, until a single metallic tone rang across the desert. Not from any vehicle he knew, not from his radio. The hair on his arms lifted. Right then, Hall realized something. This wasn't a human presence. And more disturbingly, he sensed that someone in command already knew he'd see it. To understand how a young airman stumbled into one of the strangest alleged encounters in US military history, you have to go back to 1965, and to the man whose testimony still drives this case, Airman Charles Hall. The Cold War was peaking, and every unexplained light in the sky could be more than rumor. Nellis Air Force Base, hidden in Nevada's endless dry ranges, had become a center for classified testing and unspoken cooperation. Officially, it was a training ground. Unofficially, it hosted programs even most officers hadn't heard of. Witnesses from Hall's unit would later confirm his assignments, and decades of military documentation place him exactly where his story begins. Amid new aircraft, foreign technology evaluations, and top-secret night operations, and in the middle of it, a 22-year-old weather observer trained to report facts, not theories. Hall's assignment sounded harmless: monitor temperature, humidity, and wind along the bomb ranges. But those ranges spanned some of the most restricted land in America, vast valleys that even senior personnel needed clearance to enter. The locations were remote enough to hide anything or anyone. When Hall first drove out there, he noticed fencing that didn't appear on maps, strange radio codes, and sudden changes in flight patterns overhead. Yet no one ever explained them. Over time, other technicians dropped cryptic hints. They joked about range for Harry, a valley supposedly haunted by tall visitors who looked human until you got close. At first, it was just base lore, the kind of tale soldiers invent to pass quiet nights. But the details were oddly consistent. Pale figures seen moving at dusk, lights rising vertically from the ground, military escorts creeping alongside unmarked craft. Hall was trained to note phenomena, not believe in them. Still, patterns were forming. His shifts were increasingly isolated. His radios sometimes went dead without interference, and the command briefings grew tense whenever range for came up. One night, he watched a security truck idle at a spot where no vehicle should have been. The driver stared toward the desert, not moving. Moments later, 3 luminous forms emerged from the dark, tall, thin silhouettes that turned slightly as if acknowledging the man on duty. None of this fit within military procedure. Yet Hall's logs, if they reached command, were never returned. When he mentioned unusual lights, his supervisor told him simply, "Don't record everything you see." That's when he understood. He wasn't alone out there by accident. He'd been placed there deliberately. Someone wanted an observer who wouldn't ask questions. Those early encounters marked the beginning of a mystery that would follow Hall for decades, corroborated later by service records and base maps matching his descriptions. What he saw, the way the military behaved, and the subtle deference shown around certain desert zones all pointed toward something far beyond conventional technology. Later, in sworn interviews and written testimony, Hall described his visitors as tall whites. They appeared human in outline, but exuded a different energy, a calm intelligence that felt both analytical and ancient. His words became foundational evidence for researchers still trying to decode what the US military might have been protecting in those years. Were they scientists? Diplomats? Intruders? No one at Nellis would say. But whatever their purpose, the Air Force seemed to accommodate it. Hall's world, once measured in weather readings, suddenly expanded into something almost cosmic. The shimmer that night was only the beginning. To understand what Hall saw, we have to go back to where it all began, Range 4. Section 1, Nellis Desert Encounter. The wind at Nellis never really stopped, it just shifted moods. That morning, Hall left base in a battered pickup, a notebook on the seat beside him, driving toward range for where few ever went alone. Command wanted a continuous sequence of meteorological readings across the empty flats. Nothing unusual, except that empty never quite matched what he found out there. The deeper he went into the restricted area, the more the landscape felt watched, quiet in a way that seemed deliberate. Hall was a weather observer, not a dreamer. His job was methodical: deploy a theodolite, track balloons, report data. Numbers didn't lie, and that's what kept him grounded after nights when the desert lights danced in defiance of physics. These weren't the flares or aircraft he'd learned to recognize. The lights rose vertically, darted sideways without inertia, then stopped dead as if gravity didn't exist. The first few times, he convinced himself it was experimental hardware from the inner ranges. But then he noticed their pale outlines, tall figures that sometimes followed him with their gaze. He tried ignoring them. So did the other personnel, at least on paper. Still, conversations in the mess hall always circled back to whispers about range visitors. Someone swore a jeep convoy vanished between checkpoints. Another claimed they'd seen something white cross the runway at Indian Springs with no heat signature. Hall couldn't shake the unease that came with routine patterns of secrecy. He knew Cold War testing made odd things normal, yet this wasn't that kind of secrecy. It was colder, older, sanctioned but unspoken. One evening, while logging sunset readings, he caught movement along a ridge. 3 tall forms stood silhouetted against the fading light. They didn't walk, they glided, effortless and silent, robes or suits catching the last orange hue of dusk. The sight locked him still. He rubbed his eyes, expecting distortion from light fatigue. When he looked again, the figures were gone, replaced by faint footprints that seemed too uniform, too precise, spaced as though measured by machine. That night, his radio failed. Instead of static, only a pressurized hum filled the speaker, a sound almost biological. He adjusted dials, tapped the unit, nothing. The next morning maintenance checked and found no issue. Could have been interference, one technician said, avoiding eye contact. Hall read the subtext, don't ask questions. Days blurred. Weather data kept coming, the same arid readings, the same silence stretching beyond the reach of command towers. Yet every so often, equipment malfunctioned mysteriously, timepieces lost minutes, and the desert would flash white for an instant, like lightning without thunder. Hall kept detailed notes. Clouds don't behave that way, he wrote. Neither do aircraft. The more he documented, the more attention he attracted, not from superiors, but from something else. Once, driving back before dawn, he spotted a humanoid shape standing near a cluster of rocks. Everyone on base called that area the nursery, rumor being it's where the creatures were often seen. He slowed his truck, headlights sweeping across the plain. The figure didn't flinch. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with long features and pale, almost luminescent skin. When the lights hit its eyes, they seemed to refract the beam like glass. He froze, heart pounding, though his body felt oddly calm, as if the fear had been switched off. Then, the figure lifted a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement, before walking away into the darkness. Back at base, he reported only unidentified movement. The commanding officer signed off wordlessly. That silence said everything. There were no follow-up questions, no ridicule, just a sealed report and a subtle warning in the captain's tone. Stick to the weather, Airman. Hall realized the chain of command already knew. Others had brushed against the same truth. Mechanics told him of lights reflecting off radar domes, but registering no radar returns. A cook once mentioned delivering supplies to a guest wing built beneath a hangar near Range 4, though he'd been blindfolded en route. Then came that chilling briefing before a solo rotation. Maintain your schedule. If you encounter personnel outside protocol, observe proper distance. Nobody clarified what outside protocol meant, but Hall didn't have to guess. The next encounter removed all doubt. Midway through his shift, he heard a faint whine, not mechanical yet perfectly tonal. He looked up and froze. Above him hovered an object roughly the size of a bus, white and featureless, suspended in midair without visible propulsion. Its movement was precise, not drifting but balancing over his position, as if calibrating him. For a moment, the air grew dense, his skin prickling with static. Then, from beneath the craft, 3 tall beings descended slowly. Either stepping or floating, he couldn't tell. They landed without sound. They studied him the way scientists might inspect an animal newly discovered. Their motions were graceful, deliberate, and strangely confident, as if they knew he wouldn't run. One of them spoke, or perhaps transmitted a thought, something like a soft musical tone that struck directly inside his skull. Not painful, just startling. The experience lasted seconds, maybe minutes. When they returned toward the craft, an invisible wave passed through the sand, and they vanished. Back at the shack, the environment returned to normal. Instruments still worked, though his wristwatch had advanced 11 minutes. He filed an incomplete report, handwriting shaking just slightly. There was no place for missing time in Air Force paperwork. He didn't sleep that night. The encounter replayed over and over. How the light had curved around them, how their movements felt calculated yet oddly compassionate. He wasn't sure if they'd spared him or scanned him. From that day, small signals confirmed his unspoken suspicion. Security patrols started showing up near his station right after sunset, lingering until dawn. Thrumming sounds echoed across the valley some nights, synchronized like machinery beneath the ground. One technical sergeant, after a few drinks, let slip that some guests used the far ridge for travel, protected under diplomatic protocols. The man laughed it off, but his eyes betrayed fear. Hall noted every detail in the margins of his notebook. He'd come to Nellis to measure weather, but what he was recording now had nothing to do with atmospheric fronts. Something had embedded itself within the military machine, too big to confront, too intelligent to reveal fully. Every step, every controlled contact suggested organization, rules governing the presence of these beings. Weeks later, headquarters reassigned him permanently to Range 4, the very place rumored to host the visitors. Officially, it was simple logistics. He'd proven reliable in isolation. Unofficially, he understood the unspoken reason. Someone wanted him there precisely because he'd seen them and hadn't panicked. The trust was mutual silence. When he signed his orders, the base adjutant said quietly, "Follow procedures, stay in the lanes, report conditions only." Then came a slight pause. "And remember, some things out there aren't ours." That statement echoed louder than any classified code. Hall left the office knowing he was walking into something beyond meteorology, a new formation where science ended and secrecy began. The desert ahead seemed wider now, not just sand and heat, but corridors of the unknown. Days later, his orders changed, and so did the rules. Section 2, Establishing Contact. Range for Harry stretched far beyond the reach of radio towers, where the dunes rolled like bronze waves and silence earned command over every sound. When Hall took over full-time duty there, the pickup was stocked with supplies for 10 days, plus one new addition, a laminated sheet of field safety protocols. It read like survival notes: maintain visual distance, no sudden gestures, avoid vocal volume escalation, respect designated lanes. There was no signature line, no explanation, and half of the instructions seemed unrelated to any known military procedure. Hall drove out before sunrise. As the sky paled, the valley shimmered in mirrored layers. The heat hadn't arrived yet, but the air already trembled with the same electrical tension he'd felt that first night. He parked near a low ridge that overlooked an expanse of cracked soil dotted with markers painted white. According to his map, those were reference points for weather balloons, but they formed perfect geometric arcs. Patterns that felt planned, not accidental. For 2 days, he saw nothing unusual. Measurements, reports, routine. Then near dusk on the 3rd, movement flickered near the far boundary. For tall figures glided along the marked path, their elongated limbs catching the dying light. Hall froze by instinct, but remembered the sheet's calm directives. He stood still, clipboard down, heart pounding loud enough to feel through his boots. One of the beings paused, turning toward him. The eyes, faintly luminous, seemed to weigh not just his presence, but his intent. They approached in slow precision until they stopped roughly 30 meters away. Hall lifted a cautious hand, a neutral greeting soldiers used among patrols. The tallest figure mirrored the motion with a slight delay, as though determining meaning. Then came a strange hush inside his head. It wasn't a sound, more like a clear awareness carrying a single phrase that wasn't a word, safe. His shoulders loosened before he could question why. He didn't feel scanned or invaded, only observed. Minutes passed. When he blinked, they were gone, leaving faint depressions in the sand, deeper than footprints should have been. That encounter shifted everything. Hall wasn't debriefed that week, an anomaly on its own. Technicians dropped by with crates labeled station upgrades, which turned out to be fresh transmitters he wasn't authorized to install. Each night, he sensed more patrols circling unseen. A rhythm had formed between his solitude and their appearances, like the pulse of two adjacent systems learning to coexist. A few nights later, contact advanced. Hall awoke in his small shelter to a metallic chime echoing outside. The temperature had dropped sharply, frost glinting under a hazy moon. He stepped out, and 3 of them stood near the marker posts, motionless. The light from their clothing shifted hues, pale blue to soft gold, like an aura following pulse beats. The tallest one raised an object, elbow length, ridged like coral. With a dim vibration, the wind around Hall softened, and his breath no longer misted in the cold. That was when comprehension arrived without words. Ideas, sequences, impressions about temperature balance and wave harmonics filled his head as if downloaded. He stumbled back, overwhelmed by understanding shapes instead of sentences. When the figures receded, the air snapped back to the chill of midnight. Hall noted the event mechanically, as though instinctively following training for something unspoken. His instruments had recorded no temperature swing, no wind deviation, yet his skin told another story. The next morning, a security jeep idled a few hundred feet away, tinted windows up. Nobody stepped out, but the message was clear. He was seen, managed, contained. Soon after, further procedures arrived printed in red. Do not attempt unauthorized communication. Remain calm during nocturnal observation. Report only meteorological data. Hall laughed softly reading it. Calm was the only choice left when surrounded by forces that could unmake fear itself. Over weeks, the pattern became formalized. Dusk appearances, silent exchanges, soft pulses of light. The visitors sometimes trailed mechanical devices, small orbs hovering waist-high, moving with insect precision. Once, one of the devices settled near Hall's theodolite. It emitted a thread of white light scanning the instrument, then projected a geometric hologram above the sand, 3 concentric spheres rotating within each other. When he reached out, the image flickered out like breath on glass. The beings nearby seemed content with his reaction, slight nods betraying something akin to approval. The more exposure Hall had, the more deliberate his placement appeared. Supply manifests always included extra rations that nobody claimed responsibility for. Replacement batteries arrived before he requested them. At times, his own field reports returned from headquarters with altered timestamps. It felt less like oversight, more like orchestration, a puzzle where he was the living variable. Emotionally, curiosity replaced fear. Hall likened it to standing beside an avalanche that had already decided not to bury you. He couldn't explain why he trusted them, but every measured gesture, every exchange of thought carried an undercurrent of control without cruelty. They weren't probing for dominance, they were gauging compatibility. Still, tension simmered. Once, while tracking humidity changes, bright flares erupted across the ridge, military signal rounds. A convoy approached, headlights blacked out except for infrared markers. From the haze emerged a team of airmen in desert camouflage, escorting 2 of the tall beings. Their posture was protective toward the aliens, not the other way around. One human shouted, "Remain in your lane." Hall obeyed, stepping aside as they passed toward a slope where an enormous oval object rested half-buried. Its surface was smooth as bone. Technicians moved with studied efficiency, plugging cables from ground generators into recesses that glowed faint blue. Hall realized he was witnessing maintenance, not of a human craft, but theirs. After the convoy left, he walked the site quietly. The sand radiated residual warmth, rhythmic like breathing beneath his boots. He wanted to believe it was machinery venting heat, yet a faint hum still carried through the night. Recording it felt futile. No device would capture frequencies half beyond perception. Hall's relationship with the visitors evolved into silent coexistence. He began anticipating their arrival through subtle temperature drops and faint tonal harmonics in the distance. Once, one of the younger ones, smaller, perhaps childlike, stepped closer than usual, mirrored his handwriting motion in the air, then retreated under a stern glance from the taller guides. The hierarchy was obvious, and even their discipline mirrored military order. Fear returned only fleetingly, in moments of solitude, when he'd replay the impossibility of it all. If these beings existed with such mastery of physics, what did they want here among soldiers and dust? They never took resources, never demanded submission. Yet the U.S. Air Force behaved as if hosting royalty. Hall sensed agreements older than his assignment, an established protocol balancing curiosity with caution. The desert was their embassy, and he was the accidental attaché. He learned subtle signals, how a certain hand tilt meant farewell, a low hum indicated observation mode. Once during a sandstorm, one appeared beside his shelter, using a narrow rod that emitted a shimmering field deflecting the gust like an invisible wall. The figure waited until the wind subsided, then simply nodded and vanished into the cobalt twilight. Gratitude and dread blurred together. He felt protected, but owned. Eventually, his reports changed tone. Numbers still filled the pages, but margins carried impressions. The way light bent around them, their measured patience, the quiet authority in their gestures. Each entry deepened his conviction that both species were learning boundaries in real time. The Air Force acted as moderator. He was data collector and participant alike. At headquarters, briefings tightened, shorter, colder, reduced to logistics. Hall noticed new officers with insignia he didn't recognize, their insignias adorned by subtle silver motifs. Questions about his emotional state replaced technical ones. "Are you managing stress, Airman?" one asked with mechanical concern. He knew these weren't psychiatrists. They were evaluators ensuring neutrality under extraordinary contact. Then the routine shifted. An envelope without markings instructed him to continue Phase 2 engagement. It contained coordinates deeper than any location he'd been cleared for. The document ended with 5 words that encapsulated both trust and warning. "They will acknowledge you now." As he folded the paper, the desert outside seemed to inhale. Hall sensed that the controlled observation phase was over. The next would be communication, directed and intentional. The contact that once unfolded by accident was now policy. But the Air Force wasn't just letting this happen, they were managing it. Section 3. The military's hidden protocols. On paper, Range existed only as another weather testing sector inside Nellis. In reality, it was an island of silence ringed by invisible borders. After Hall's formal integration into that zone, he noticed subtle shifts in how orders reached him. Messages no longer came by routine radio. Now they arrived through short-range encrypted bursts from a relay truck. His debriefs were relocated to a small office inside a hangar guarded by men who wore no unit patches. Even the smell was different inside, ozone machine oil, something sterile, like a hospital that never saw sunlight. During those meetings, language changed. Officers who once spoke plainly now layered their words in code. Any mention of meteorological anomalies clearly meant encounters. Guest logistics referred to craft maintenance. Human interface described briefings with personnel exposed to the beings. Hall realized that he wasn't attending weather reviews. He was being measured for compliance. Everything that had felt spontaneous in the desert was in fact governed by a framework invisible to most of the base. Secrecy-fed structure. Range safety maps suddenly carried shaded zones marked as diplomatic corridors. Pilots received orders to avoid those airspaces under penalty of grounding. Ground convoys diverted miles around them without explanation. When Hall asked a transport sergeant why, the man muttered, "Foreign clearance," and refused eye contact. The phrase lingered, foreign clearance for whom? Inside the base, talk of range for Harry never went beyond whispers. One mechanic joked about needing a passport to move through that sector before quickly retracting the comment when a security officer entered the room. Hall recognized the tension of compartmentalization, where everyone knew fragments of the truth, but no one dared connect them. Information was rationed by rank and by emotional stability. The few allowed persistent access were chosen for 2 traits, composure and loyalty. Hall possessed both and, as he later understood, that made him an ideal observer. The Air Force didn't deny the existence of the visitors, it redefined them. Official phrasing cast them as external consultants under non-terrestrial authority. Hall found the term printed once at the top of a heavily redacted bulletin pinned in the comms trailer. It vanished 2 hours later. Within days, the bulletin board itself was replaced. When he asked about it, officers smiled thinly and changed topics. Such replacements happened often, new equipment appearing overnight, manifests unsigned, trucks idling near hangars marked temporarily closed. From his post, Hall noticed how training flights altered schedules depending on unseen activities in the valley. Whenever the luminous craft were expected, daytime exercises shifted north toward Tonopah. Radar teams were temporarily reassigned to maintenance. Whole sections of airspace would blink off the navigation grid for 12-hour intervals. Those patterns weren't coincidences. They were evidence of coordination between human command and something that required secrecy beyond any Cold War weapon. He began comparing it with known black projects. Rumors about Program Constant Peg, where US pilots secretly flew Soviet jets, had whispered through the canteen months earlier. The idea was to simulate the enemy for tactical advantage. To Hall, range felt like the same logic applied beyond Earth. Study an otherworldly force under controlled terms. He remembered an instructor once saying, "Any foreign tech working with us is a negotiation, not charity." Now that line carried new meaning. Each visitor had a chaperone, armed airmen nicknamed handlers. Their uniforms bore subtle differences, flattened insignia, silver-gray trimming instead of color. Hall observed them escort the beings toward secured hangars near the ridgeline at dusk. The humans walked in deliberate formation beside their towering guests, maintaining a fixed 2-meter gap as if honoring diplomatic protocol. Floodlights dimmed while they passed, creating a corridor of shadow around the delegation. Hall timed it once. The sequence lasted precisely 7 minutes, never a second more. Curiosity gnawed at him. He started cataloging behavioral clues. Whenever a tall white appeared on base property, radios switched frequencies automatically. Guard rotations doubled. Pilots were grounded from non-essential flights. Even mess hall service slowed down. It was as though every system acknowledged their presence through invisible automation. Yet there were never public memos, no new security briefings. The coordination seemed telegraphed through intuition alone, or perhaps direct command from somewhere higher than Nellis itself. One evening, Hall caught 2 junior officers arguing outside the weather office. One hissed, "They said minimal exposure hours, he's past quota." The other replied, "Orders from Washington, keep him stationed." They fell silent when Hall approached. That was the first time he realized his assignment wasn't local. It was embedded in a chain reaching far beyond base jurisdiction. Documents arrived one morning bearing a crimson stamp, Observation Integration Protocol. The outline matched everything he'd already experienced: environmental isolation, restricted interaction, and emotional neutrality. Yet Section 5 startled him. It defined extraterrestrial liaison as a recognized operational category under defense cooperation. The implications were staggering. Buried inside bureaucracy, the government had language prepared for beings not of Earth. Military efficiency masked cosmic diplomacy. Hall saw how tradition adapted. Salutes for entities 9 feet tall, convoy lights dimmed for privacy, codes disguised as mundane logistics. Orders filtered through those invisible systems like blood through capillaries. Everyone obeyed without full comprehension, sustaining a delicate peace built on procedure instead of belief. He noticed small humane details too. Medical staff stored sealed cases labeled Environmental Support Equipment, TW. Mechanics transported tall, narrow chairs matching no aircraft cockpit dimension known. Even cafeteria inventory included elongated utensils. Every clue suggested the visitors occupied more than the desert. They occupied infrastructure woven quietly into base life. The more Hall looked, the clearer the hierarchy appeared. The Air Force treated the tall whites not as commanders, but as guests of a superior ally. Respectful containment was the unwritten motto. Encounters required 2 human witnesses whenever possible, though exceptions were made for Hall's role. If fear broke discipline, those individuals were reassigned instantly, sometimes vanishing from rosters overnight. Hall once asked an older sergeant how long this arrangement had existed. The man exhaled, sandpaper rasp in his throat. "Longer than you've been alive, son. Maybe longer than jet fuel." Then he walked away. That reply sank like a stone, suggesting the alliance reached back to an early generation of secrecy, perhaps before flight itself had turned supersonic. The strangest directive came months later. All personnel were to treat nighttime illuminations on the valley floor as sovereign activity. That single phrase redefined extraterrestrial motion into a diplomatic act, transforming potential contact events into routine protocol. Hall realized reality had been rewritten through semantics. Language protected the secret better than walls ever could. Among those trusted few, fatigue blended with reverence. They no longer questioned whether the visitors were real, but debated their motives. One pilot compared it to hosting ambassadors from a kingdom no one could visit. Another whispered that the tall whites trained elite crews in navigation beyond human comprehension. Hall wasn't sure who believed which version, but each story reinforced a single truth. The military was not in control, it was in coordination. There were cracks, though. A newly transferred captain ignored a closure notice and flew reconnaissance across range for at low altitude. His aircraft returned intact, but every onboard recording device registered pure white static. Within 48 hours, he was reassigned overseas. The incident became legend, proof that defying the unmapped zones carried consequences nothing in official doctrine could explain. Hall's notebooks filled with silent confirmations, altered flight grids, hierarchical terminology, diplomatic jargon, vanishing colleagues. Each element pointed toward an organized cohabitation hidden under national defense. The question no one dared voice was what the tall whites offered in return. Advanced propulsion glimpses? Strategic foresight? Psychological experiments? The secrecy implied value too immense to expose. After months inside this careful theater, Hall understood the unspoken equilibrium. The Air Force maintained order on Earth's behalf. The tall whites maintained mystery on theirs. Observers like him were instruments of trust, ensuring the line between mutual curiosity and intrusion never blurred. It wasn't about proving existence, it was about sustaining coexistence. The silence that once unnerved him evolved into comprehension. Every escort, every shaded code, every classified omission built a system that made the impossible routine. Within that quiet machinery, human and alien hierarchies intertwined so seamlessly that reality itself began to feel managed. The question wasn't whether they were real, it was what the deal actually was, and why the Air Force continued protecting it long after official silence set in. Every corroborating report, every document aligning with Hall's field data, lent support to a theory taking shape. That a covert relationship existed, its purpose evolving under layers of code and caution. The deeper Hall probed, the clearer the pattern became, a secret agenda slowly revealing itself through clues, not confession. Section 4, the alleged agreement. By late 1966, Hall began sensing motive inside the patterns. The Air Force's precision around range wasn't just containment, it hinted at understanding. Logistics data he overheard pointed to supply transfers scheduled at the same times the luminous craft appeared. Fuel drums labeled for weather stations were rerouted to sealed convoys under desert maintenance operations. Their destination matched areas Hall had seen bathed in that strange white light. Something transactional was happening behind the veil of meteorology. One morning, while waiting for equipment replacement, he stumbled upon a maintenance technician stacking crates near Hangar 18. Every box bore double labeling, his own unit insignia stamped over another line discreetly lettered TW support. The logic clicked then, tall white support. When the technician noticed Hall's stare, he shrugged, muttering, "Trade stuff, I guess," before locking the truck doors. The term trade lingered longer than it should have. Rumor rippled quietly among trusted ranks. One airman talked about exchange days when human mechanics provided materials, titanium sheets, lubricants, power cells, and in return the visitors offered data charts with principles beyond known aerodynamics. No one called it technology transfer, but parts of the base started using alloys too advanced for any official supplier. Hall learned to track these shifts by smell, the metallic tang of new composites replacing the diesel reek of old stock. He pieced it together gradually. The supposed agreement wasn't written down, but it lived in the rhythm of base logistics. Resources out, insights in, secrecy maintained. The tall whites operated from their desert enclaves, and in exchange the United States provided safe haven, materials, and mutual discretion. The Air Force didn't call it an alliance, it was an arrangement. Almost diplomatic, but rooted in fear of exposure rather than friendship. Hall's proof came by accident. During a late supply run, his Jeep's transmission failed near the edge of an unlisted valley. While waiting for assistance, he heard a low hum building under the surface. Moments later, a truck convoy descended the ridge above. 3 military vehicles followed by a smaller, glossy white craft floating 2 feet above ground. The escort stopped at a camouflaged entrance that split open like a sliding stone door. Inside, golden light pulsed rhythmically. Hall's breath froze as he glimpsed silhouettes moving within, both human and unmistakably tall outlines. One officer stepped forward carrying containers that glowed faintly from the inside. Moments later, the convoy reversed, sealing the entrance. When his rescue crew arrived, they pretended not to see the fading light under the sand. "Forget the wreck, we'll tow it tomorrow," the driver said curtly. On returning to base, no one logged the breakdown. The incident report line was left blank. That was confirmation enough. This was sanctioned. Hall reflected on what made the relationship possible. The tallwhites possessed knowledge but required elements, rare minerals, energy sources, perhaps refuge. The U.S. military offered both, and in exchange received fragments of understanding, just enough to advance without equal footing. It was a delicate barter built on unequal power. The visitors could vanish at will. The military could only protect the silence around them. He noticed the asymmetry reflected in demeanor. The Air Force treated tall, white arrivals as routine but reverent. Officers lowered voices, movements slowed. When one visitor gestured disapproval during an inspection, the colonel present saluted reflexively, as if chastised by superior rank. Yet these beings never barked orders. Communication flowed through quiet consent, a glance or sound replacing language. The humans performed diplomacy without dialogue, a pantomime of compliance. Hall once overheard senior staff debating maintenance protocols. One insisted the visitors' crafts shouldn't receive human electrical support, citing safety. Another countered, Directive 4 authorizes interoperability assistance. The phrase revealed policy depth. Directive 4 implied earlier directives existed, maybe dating back to the 195s. Somewhere inside the Pentagon, paperwork legitimized a partnership everyone pretended didn't exist. Late nights in the shack, Hall analyzed parallels. Around those same years, rumors swirled of secret research leaps, transistor miniaturization, lightweight composites, stealth coatings. None directly connected, yet timelines matched the period following increased tall white activity. Could these fragments be influence disguised as coincidence? He couldn't prove causality, only observe synchronicity. Still, he felt pieces of their intelligence quietly grafted onto human progress, like seeds slipped into fertile soil. Not everyone accepted the arrangement without anxiety. A communications specialist he befriended confided fears. We've given them too much leash. What if we're just the study group? Hall understood. Cooperation blurred into submission when knowledge became currency. The Air Force held the illusion of control, but he'd seen how swiftly priorities bent to accommodate alien schedules. The emotional undercurrent across the base thickened, half awe, half resignation. Soldiers whispered comparisons to Cold War alliances, temporary, strategic, risky. Yet this one had no treaties, no headlines, no expiration. It survived only through denial. To Hall, the danger wasn't invasion but dependency. Every time human systems adjusted to alien preferences, sovereignty dimmed a little more. He wrote guarded entries describing shared ground utilization, his code for nights when both species converged on the same valley. Instruments from both sides decorated the dunes, tripods, sensors, glowing rods that hummed like beehives. Tasks unfolded efficiently, almost choreographed. Once, while sketching temperature readings, he noticed a tall white studying his pencil as though fascinated by the act of recording. In return, it sank a finger into the sand, tracing lines that rearranged themselves into perfect geometric figures, triangles interlacing until they formed a three-dimensional lattice. The creature stepped back, leaving the pattern pulsing faint light before wind erased it. Trade of knowledge and wonder, symbolic yet tangible. The mutual tolerance carried unspoken costs. Hall learned that mishandling protocol meant more than reprimand, it risked reprisal. One supply officer deviated from coordinates, cutting through a restricted corridor after midnight. His truck exploded in a silent flash visible from range 3. No wreckage, only a crater rimmed with vitrified glass. Official story, fuel leak. Unofficially, personnel whispered it was defensive response from the visitor's perimeter system. Cooperation, yes, but never equality. He also noticed how schedules synchronized with celestial cycles, especially lunar phases. On full moon nights, activity peaked, convoys doubled, communication blackouts extended. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe their technology responded organically to gravitational shifts. Hall could only log correlations, aware someone above him read every word carefully before consigning reports to classified storage. By 1967, the arrangement had matured into routine logistics. Desert roads once desolate now bore faint tire impressions by dawn. Base infrastructure adapted, underground conduits, thermal power feeds running toward uncharted zones. Hall walked those routes during maintenance checks, feeling vibration through boots, regular, heart-like pulses deep in the sand. The deal had literal foundations. Still, uncertainty persisted around motive. Were the tall whites allies seeking understanding, or surveyors charting eventual ownership? Hall's notebook wrestled with both possibilities. Some accounts painted them as cautious benefactors, fascinated by human adaptation. Others hinted at calculated observers ensuring humanity's growth aligned with their interests. Friendship or oversight, it depended on who controlled interpretation. Hall, ever the observer, decided meaning lived in behavior. They'd never attacked without provocation, never demanded worship or labor. Their only constant was boundary control and the steady request for materials. Perhaps that was their agenda: study resource extraction, monitor civilization's technological plateau, and offer nudges when advancement served dual ends. Inside the command hierarchy, debates mirrored his doubts. Some officers saw mutual advancement as the wager of destiny. Others feared contamination of purpose. A senior colonel summarized it best during a rare candid moment: "We're running an embassy for gods who don't need diplomats." That statement chilled Hall. It captured the existential imbalance perfectly. As months bled into years, secrecy normalized. Hall stopped marveling when the desert sang with harmonic resonance, or when unmarked aircraft followed alien trajectories. It all became part of a living truce, materials exchanged for understanding, quiet nights traded for whispered evolution. Whatever they were giving us, it wasn't free, and Hall's first-hand logs, combined with testimony from other personnel, offered the first credible glimpse into what that cost might have been. Each entry pointed to a consistent trade of materials and information, a quiet exchange that hinted at purpose but never fully disclosed it. What began as routine observation now looked like participation in something deliberate, a secret agenda still hidden in plain sight. Section 5. Glimpses of Advanced Technology. Hall's clearest memories of that period weren't the faces, if beings that tall and light-filled could even be called faces, but the machinery that seemed to hum with life beyond design. The first scout craft he saw up close hung effortlessly above a ridge, silent and white as bone. It wasn't flat or disc-shaped like the stories. More like a teardrop the size of a bus, smooth and self-illuminated, its glow adjusting in pulse with the desert wind. No seams, no rivets, no exhaust. When it moved, sand lifted gently beneath it, bending rather than blowing away, as if gravity itself yielded in respect. He'd been trained to estimate altitude and speed, but the numbers meant nothing here. The craft darted from stillness to half a mile away without acceleration, then back again with an elegance that mocked inertia. Instruments inside the shack reacted too. Compasses spun once, then stabilized facing north no matter the direction. The microwave anemometer briefly reported wind flows, exceeding recorded extremes, yet without visible motion. Hall understood then why aviators whispered of foreign visitors. Nothing in the U.S. arsenal, not even secret prototypes, behaved like this. Closer encounters deepened the mystery. One afternoon, while replacing sensors near the base of Range 4's plateau, Hall found shallow impressions forming geometries. Triangles within circles scorched into the sand though no heat registered. Minutes later, a soft vibration passed underfoot, a rhythm too structured to be seismic. Through the shimmer, a metallic sphere floated up, no larger than a motorcycle. Panels unfurled from its surface like petals, emitting a harmonic tone that resonated inside his chest cavity more than his ears. The air thickened, and for an instant, his heartbeat aligned with the pulse. He reached toward it and felt resistance like pushing against water though nothing was there. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the sphere contracted inward, vanishing with a vacuum pop. Military technicians arrived within the hour without being called. They cordoned the area, took soil samples, and left without exchanging a word. When Hall asked an escorting NCO what had just happened, the man replied, "Routine compatibility test," and walked off. Those 3 words suggested managed knowledge, as though humans were running diagnostics on technology they only partially understood. Hall wasn't a physicist, but his curiosity drove him to theorize. In his notebooks, years later published as his photon theory, he speculated that different densities of light particles allowed controlled alteration of gravity fields. What he witnessed, he reasoned, wasn't propulsion but manipulation of local constants, light serving as both engine and environment. His speculation might have sounded wild, yet he noticed it paralleled whispered research trends. New lab experiments about photonic pressure and quantum vacuums had begun surfacing in classified briefings around that time. Coincidence or quiet inspiration? He couldn't decide. The beings themselves carried smaller devices, wands about half a meter long producing faint blue auras. During one sandstorm, a tall white raised one of these rods. Within seconds, dust particles diverted around them in spiraling streams, leaving a calm pocket of air despite 30-knot winds outside. Hall suspected electromagnetic containment at first, but the silence within disproved that theory. No hum, no static discharge. It was as if matter responded obediently to the user's will. Later observations showed variation by rank. Older individuals wielded multi-ringed instruments projecting fields wide enough to shield an entire jeep. Another evening, he saw one step from the craft wearing a form-fitting suit etched with faint circuit patterns. Each motion left afterimages of light threads, lagging half a second behind movement like ghost copies adjusting reality into place. When it bent to retrieve a dropped tool, its entire form lifted several inches, hovering long enough for the gesture to complete. Levitation? Hall doubted biological flight, but suspected embedded technology interfacing directly with neuromotor impulses, equipment that obeyed thought rather than touch. Telepathic coordination seemed standard. He frequently sensed directions forming in his mind seconds before they acted. These glimpses leaked into the base through subtle borrowings. Engineers experimented with heat-resistant alloys resembling the sheen of those crafts. Surveillance officers discussed silent signature coatings that diffused radar similar to the craft's luminous field. Hall overheard mechanics referencing microlattice structures capable of dispersing thermal radiation, an echo of the convex hull he'd glimpsed that night on the hillside. While mainstream development credited domestic research hubs, Hall suspected peripheral observation of alien materials had quietly accelerated those breakthroughs. Even communications protocols seemed influenced. Standard radio arrays near range incorporated a new phase shift system reportedly capable of transmitting data via light pulses at unprecedented speed. When Hall joked about it being interstellar Wi-Fi, his supervisor's stare froze in mid-sentence, joking apparently tread too close to truth. Soon after, messages from headquarters arrived through coded bursts that produced brief flashes on equipment instead of tones. It felt oddly symbolic. Even human messages began to speak in light. But perhaps the most haunting demonstration came one night when a tall white approached carrying a crystalline disc scarcely larger than a coin. The being pressed it against Hall's wrist without contact. Light seeped beneath the skin like diffuse ink. Instantly his fatigue vanished. Vision sharpened. Every frequency from wind rustle to heartbeat composed a perfect chord in his mind. He gasped, overwhelmed by sensory clarity, and when the disc withdrew its glow, exhaustion collapsed over him like shadow returning. Later, he noticed a faint geometric mark on his wrist that lingered for days, skin cells beneath sluggish to heal. Whatever that object did, it engaged body chemistry at a level unknown to medicine. Hall believed he'd glimpsed their approach to biology, healing and strength as extensions of physics. They don't differentiate between energy and life, he wrote. Power is nourishment. The idea haunted him because it explained their endurance, lifespans stretching centuries, movements tireless, skin unaging. If their science merged vitality with electromagnetism, death itself might be optional. At Nellis, whispers about longevity incidents circulated quietly. A flight surgeon once confided that tissue recovered from an alleged training accident near range retained cellular vitality long after isolation. No official record supported that claim, but the rumor neatly paralleled Hall's mark and the alien's biological resilience. The blend of fantasy and plausibility blurred into one texture of secrecy. Years later, journalists and disclosure activists connected those timelines to sudden leaps in human capability. Fiber optics, integrated circuits, even early experiments in laser guidance. Hall would neither confirm nor deny the link, only remark that coincidence had become pattern. Technology is like weather, he told an interviewer. You can't prove where the wind begins, only where it blows. Despite fascination, he remained aware of the hollow at the center, zero physical proof. No artifact he could keep, no photograph that survived clearance review. Every observable detail lived solely in testimony, yet even skeptics admitted the consistency of his technical recall. Coordinates, atmospheric readings, electromagnetic observations, all matched Nellis data later declassified for unrelated projects. Hall's credibility relied not on evidence, but precision. He often wondered if that was deliberate, the tallwhites revealing just enough to inspire replication without leaving fingerprints. Humanity advanced through imitation of ghosts. The arrangement fit their temperament, study without disclosure, guidance without contact. Each glimpse he caught might have been staged, a curated syllabus for an eager if unknowing pupil. Still, on certain nights when desert air shimmered with faint ion tracers, Hall imagined seeing that craft again, humming softly, edges dissolving into starlight. The sense that gravity itself bowed briefly toward intelligence remained his ultimate proof. Whatever he had witnessed on those silent dunes operated on a spectrum where science blurred into artistry. And though decades passed, that single memory of gentle hovering light convinced him that technology, in their hands, was indistinguishable from grace. Then came the detail that tied it all together, a presence that didn't stay hidden. Section 6. Evidence of ongoing contact. Decades passed, but the air around Nellis never stopped humming with unanswered questions. For Charles Hall, the desert retained memory. Those remote valleys kept whispering stories long after he left active duty. 50 years on, new sightings and testimonies began cropping up, hinting that the visitors he'd met were never gone. It wasn't nostalgia driving those reports, it was continuity. The same geography, the same silences, the same pale lights tracing impossible angles across the sky. Pilots flying over the Nevada test range during routine exercises described bright vertical ascents near Indian Springs, movements too swift for drones and too controlled for flares. One reservist, recorded anonymously in a 199's aviation forum, said he watched a luminous object pace his aircraft for almost a minute before shooting skyward like it ignored friction. When he landed, debriefing officers confiscated his tapes and logged it as air ionization anomaly. That phrasing felt borrowed straight from the Cold War-era vocabulary used to disguise encounters. The locations matched Hall's coordinates precisely. Civilian radar technicians around Las Vegas began noticing occasional spikes, blips appearing hundreds of miles above the range for seconds at a time, then vanishing without transponder data. Officially, it was software glitching. Unofficially, frequencies used by base communication would change during those hours, just as Hall had described decades earlier. To researchers comparing notes, that pattern formed the outline of an ongoing presence, coordinated, periodic, methodical. Eyewitnesses weren't the only clues. In 1996, a leaked maintenance memo mentioned foreign visitors accommodated under protocol exchanged TW-02. Few paid attention at first, assuming TW referred to training weaponry. But for those steeped in Hall's account, the abbreviation drew immediate attention. The document outlined procedures for environmental calibration inside sealed hangars, for transient guests using photonic recovery units. The jargon mirrored Hall's notes about light-based equipment and climate control for tall beings sensitive to temperature extremes. When questioned, the Air Force called it a forgery, then quietly removed all references from their archives. Deletion only amplified curiosity. Journalists digging into declassified Nellis documents stumbled upon repeated redactions surrounding energy research in Range Facility 4H, eerily close to Hall's Range for Harry. No such site code existed in public maps. In 2008, satellite analysts comparing thermal images noted warm spots in exactly those valleys where no active naval or air testing was scheduled. Whatever operated there produced consistent symmetrical radiation signatures every full moon cycle, faint but structured, as though machinery lay breathing under sand. Then came testimonies from within. A retired air controller named Eddie M. gave an interview to a UFO researcher, describing radar vectors that arrived in pairs, stopped mid-sky, and merged into one. He claimed superiors instructed him to classify them as biological flocks. When he argued birds don't hover at 50,000 feet, the colonel simply said, "Not our problem if they aren't ours." That quiet fatalism mirrored the mindset Hall faced in the 190 SIXS. The certainty that denial served security better than truth. Patterns expanded worldwide, but circled back to Nevada. Airline crews reported vertical cylinders of light appearing near national park boundaries bordering military land. Amateur astronomers near Rachel, Nevada captured faint bluish columns on long-exposure images, exactly where Hall once described approach corridors. The phenomena repeated with uncanny timing every spring equinox, suggesting deliberate scheduling rather than random weather plasma. Researchers proposed mundane theories, classified propulsion tests, refraction anomalies, secret drones. Yet each explanation strained under consistency stretching across generations, different administrations, same coordinates. The range remained the constant. The desert itself had become an interface. Within the 201s, renewed government interest added strange validation. During official UAP hearings, military pilots described tic-tac-shaped objects accelerating without observable means. To most journalists, it was a new mystery. To those who'd followed Hall's record, it was déjà vu. The craft's size, silence, matte white glow, and inertia-defying flight echoed his scout ship descriptions point for point. When reporters asked defense spokespeople whether earlier sightings around Nellis related, statements turned vague. Historic incidents are outside operational scope. That answer dodged context but confirmed continuity. Something had persisted under similar conditions since Hall's tour. Conspiracy skeptics argued these parallels proved nothing. Hall's narrative might simply have influenced interpretations of later data. But even skeptical physicists admitted frustration. Propulsion-defying known laws kept appearing on military instruments. When an anomaly repeats while explanations fragment, absence of evidence begins to look like policy. Whistleblowers join the arc in subtler ways. A former contractor involved in remote sensing upgrades at the test and training range claimed his team installed subterranean power distribution for off-grid clients. The blueprints omitted recipient identities. He noticed infrastructure designed for extreme height clearances, doorways nearly 12 feet tall, ergonomic placements out of proportion with human requirements. His supervisor told him, prototype robotics lab, yet refused to show any machines. Hall's writings resurfaced online soon after, and parallels were impossible to ignore. Another account surfaced in 2021 during a podcast interview with a retired logistics officer. Without naming Hall, he recounted hosting non-national consultants during night operations decades earlier. Asked if they were human, he paused and replied, "They weren't foreign in the passport sense." That phrasing rippled through research circles, an echo of Hall's long-ago description of extraterrestrial diplomats treated like foreign allies. The line between folklore and classified reality thinned further through technology timing. Each generation's breakthroughs seemed to track renewed activity seasons in Nevada. Photonic computing prototypes after 1997 spikes, metamaterial research following 2004 radar anomalies, next-generation stealth polymers coinciding with 2018 satellite heats. To believers, coincidence had worn out its welcome. To cautious scientists, statistical clustering demanded explanation. Either U.S. innovation synchronized coincidentally with unread events, or something unseen continued offering nudges from beyond official reach. Hall, then in his 80s, commented in an interview, "History repeats easiest in isolated deserts." He said the visitors operated on long timescales, perhaps centuries, and would have no reason to end interactions just because humans changed presidents. His calm certainty struck journalists. He sounded less like a believer than a veteran describing tradition. When asked if he thought they still maintained contact, he smiled faintly. If they ever left, radar would be quieter. That understatement sparked another wave of investigation. Independent researchers mapped radar blackout logs, hours when FAA feeds near southern Nevada went dark. Between 2015 and 2024, the outages aligned uncannily with lunar perigees, same pattern marked in Hall's old diaries. Different decades, identical rhythm. The idea of persistent collaboration no longer lived only in rumor. It was pattern measured in policy gaps. A small body of leaked security photos from a 2022 drone operator showed luminous traces skimming desert ridgelines. Metadata verified location within Nellis perimeter. Analysts debated exposure artifacts versus physical motion blur, but the shape's proportional scaling suggested structured objects tens of meters long. No craft of that configuration existed in any declassified inventory. Even mainstream media, usually cautious, began tiptoeing toward speculation. A national news segment on classified aerospace partnerships referenced anonymous briefings hinting that some historical unknowns at Nellis may represent ongoing cooperative research with entities not publicly identified. The phrase "not publicly identified" sounded bureaucratic enough to hide anything, and maybe that was the point. Among UFO investigators, consensus quietly formed. Hall's encounters had never truly ended. They'd evolved into background routine. The tallwhites, once hidden diplomats in a Cold War desert, might now function as silent consultants within defense innovation pipelines. Hall's observation valleys could have become integrated research habitats sealed behind energy security contracts. For the skeptical yet curious audience, these parallels provoke unease. When secrecy repeats perfect decades later, coincidence fades into choreography. The evidence remains circumstantial, pixel blurs, anonymous memos, redacted terms, but the persistence itself becomes testimony. If nothing was there, Why does the silence cost so much to maintain? In the end, Hall offered the simplest summary, an echo of a lifetime spent balancing evidence and enigma. Proof is overrated. Patterns are the proof. For skeptical viewers, that line frames the investigation itself. His notebook margins, once filled with weather readings, now resemble forensic data linking eyewitness testimony with measurable military behavior. Each alignment adds plausibility without closing the case. And if those lights still rise from the Nevada ground today, hovering briefly before vanishing into stars, perhaps they aren't arrivals at all, but the continuing trace of an agenda still unfolding, waiting for us to connect the next clue. If they're still here, what are they working toward? Section 7. The secret agenda takes shape. For years, Charles Hall thought the question was how the arrangement worked. Only later did he realize the real mystery was why. The more he revisited those silent routines, convoys, coded briefings, measured deference, the clearer it became that the tallwhites operated with intent deeper than simple trade. Every schedule, every experiment, every polite gesture hinted at a long game whose outline only appeared when he looked back through decades of memory. He noticed it first in their observation style. They didn't gather samples or perform overt research. They watched behavior, the rhythm of shifts, the way human crews adapted under stress, the limits of patience. What fascinated them seemed psychological, not mechanical. Hall began to wonder if the military partnership was only a convenient cover for a quieter study, humanity itself under controlled conditions. It was an unsettling thought, especially for someone once proud of his role as liaison. If Earth was a laboratory, he'd been both experimenter and specimen. Records reflected similar curiosities. Declassified maintenance logs referenced cognitive sequence exposure durations, typed where radiation measurements should have been. The phrasing matched none of the Air Force's known categories. Some officers dismissed it as code substitution for electromagnetic testing, but Hall suspected otherwise. He remembered how the visitors mirrored human posture, how they lingered longest during emotional tension. The tallwhites never intervened in conflict, yet often appeared right after it. Observation through provocation, that was behavioral science. Patterns emerged around advancement too. Major leaps in aerospace occurred in synchronized waves. New composite models right after each intensive contact season. At first glance, a mutually beneficial exchange. But when Hall compared timelines across divisions, he found asymmetry. Humans advanced incrementally, while the visitors revealed nothing new. If any transfer existed, it flowed one way, toward human understanding but regulated by alien permission. That pacing resembled management, not friendship. Some within command acknowledged the unspoken hierarchy. The nickname Project Study Aid circulated privately, implying humanity was allowed to learn in installments. Veterans who'd served across eras joked grimly that the tallwhites were professors with infinite patience. The humor masked unease. No one wanted to admit that technological progress might be engineered training. Hall interviewed colleagues after leaving service. One radar operator who'd endured interference nights said he felt strong impulses of calm during anomalies, as if emotions were externally suppressed. Another technician described hearing tonal whispers before fainting near a secured hangar. The accounts echoed Hall's own sensation of mental quiet during telepathic contact. If those experiences weren't coincidence, then human perception had been subtly calibrated, perhaps to reduce panic, perhaps to measure compliance. Either motive pointed toward manipulation disguised as harmony. Hall's private notes charted new suspicions. The visitors treated emotion like data. They registered fear, tested trust, adjusted reactions until equilibrium held. Machines couldn't perform that empathy. Only intelligence with deep psychological discipline could. Whatever their agenda, it required understanding human individuality, possibly as foundation for future coexistence or control. Back at Nellis, terms like behavioral interface support began appearing on supply requisitions. Noise-canceling headgear for guards, fluorescent shields near observation windows, tools not for defense but sensory moderation. Hall realized the military had institutionalized adaptation to alien presence. Acceptance itself had become procedure. That normalization was its own success. A population of soldiers conditioned to regard extraterrestrial diplomacy as routine. Culture engineering without public knowledge. Meanwhile, distant clues suggested broader scope. International telegrams declassified decades later referenced foreign allies requesting environmental parity zones. diplomatic language identical to Range 4's diplomatic corridors. If other nations imitated U.S. phrasing, the partnership pattern might have expanded quietly through global defense circles, framed as collaborative research. In Hall's interpretation, the tall whites weren't confined to Nevada. They'd seeded governance templates designed to keep discovery manageable worldwide. The secrecy was systemic, self-replicating. He compared their composure to ecological management. Observation without exploitation, minimal footprint, long-term study of evolving species. It reminded him of wildlife conservancies, where biologists monitored animals from hidden blinds. In that analogy, humanity was the wildlife, granted territory but under watch. The difference was awareness. The human subjects ran governments, unaware their observers wrote the guidelines. That inversion chilled him. Yet alternative readings existed. Some researchers who re-examined Hall's case believed the tall whites monitored not for dominance, but for preservation. They may have viewed humanity as young kin destined for self-destruction, guiding subtly to prevent extinction. The slow release of technology could represent a moral quarantine. Teach enough to grow, not enough to burn. Hall entertained that theory reluctantly. They never harmed us, he once said, but they didn't trust us either. Whether guardian or warden might depend purely on perspective. Hints within infrastructure bolstered both views. Power conduits built decades earlier still pulsed softly on infrared scans, feeding unknown systems below ground. If operations continued, they'd achieved self-sufficiency, no longer reliant on surface logistics. Integration, perhaps assimilation. The tall whites no longer visitors, but residents with stakes intertwined in defense energy networks. Such embedding fit an agenda aiming for permanence through invisibility. When Hall revisited Nevada in later life, he sensed familiarity from the faint vibrations underfoot near old coordinates. One night, parked miles from the modern drone base, he saw 3 steady lights hovering low, equidistant, unwavering. He whispered, "I'm still here," unsure whom he addressed. The lights dimmed in sequence, like acknowledging receipt, a conversation continuing across generations. Through all contemplation, one paradox persisted. They enforced boundaries yet encouraged curiosity. That duality implied motivation beyond power, perhaps long-term coexistence conditioning. Humanity trained to confront the unknown calmly, paving way for eventual disclosure under psychological readiness. The agenda might be evolution by exposure, introducing truth slowly until fear dissolved. Military analysts reviewing Hall's debriefings decades later noticed the same pattern applied in public discourse. Governments released snippets of UFO data, confirmed presence of anomalous craft, without naming sources. Fear cycles decreased, curiosity replaced panic. If that shift was deliberate, the origin might trace back to lessons learned from Range 4. Manage awareness, measure tolerance, guide acceptance. The tall whites experiment could have scaled from one airman to an entire civilization. Physicists skeptical of aliens saw metaphor instead, a symbolic reflection of progress itself, technology guiding psychology. Yet even they acknowledged eerie precision in Hall's timeline, disrupting mere coincidence. His accounts ended exactly when social narratives about space visitors began spreading through media under government supervision. Accidental synchronization or orchestrated conditioning, it was impossible to tell. Hall concluded quietly that both species benefited from the mystery. The military maintained plausible deniability while harvesting insight. The tall whites gained a stable observation post on an evolving world. The balance required belief without proof, faith without religion, a structure mirroring science itself. That irony wasn't lost on him. Humanity had become scientist and subject simultaneously. When pressed in interviews about the visitor's ultimate intent, Hall often hesitated before answering. Finally, he condensed years of speculation into one sentence. "They're calibrating us." Calibration fit the pattern. Small adjustments over time until variables aligned. Temper, technology, tolerance. What awaited at perfect alignment, he never claimed to know. Perhaps open contact. Perhaps silent departure upon mission completion. Both outcomes meant transition. Researchers parsing his words decades later saw the beauty in ambiguity. The secret agenda wasn't conquest or salvation. It was observation seeking its own endpoint. The tall whites' patience suggested timelines longer than nations, maybe stretching until humanity matured past secrecy. In their calm mirrors, Hall believed he glimpsed a possible future where fear no longer dictated interaction. Still, mystery persisted. For every peaceful interpretation, darker theories lingered. Humans groomed as instruments for cosmic objectives, unwitting participants in expansion plans beyond comprehension. Those hypotheses thrived precisely because the evidence was always partial, balanced between reassurance and dread. Late in life, staring out over the same desert where it began, Hall wrote a final margin note beside weather data. They wanted to see if we'd learned to keep secrets as well as they can. That line captured the recursive genius of the arrangement, the study of secrecy itself. Every clue pointed to an agenda, but it wasn't what most expected. Section 8, Skeptics and Supporters. The more Hall's story spread, the more it divided those listening. Each angle, scientific, military, personal, demanded belief in something unseen, and that tested even open-minded audiences. Skeptics called it myth dressed as memoir. Supporters called it testimony encoded in discipline. Between those poles lay the space Hall's legacy still occupies, part documented history, part mirror for what people already believe about truth. Mainstream scientists dismissed his claims early on. No samples, no schematics, no verifiable data. Those absences alone framed his account as anecdote. Psychologists pointed to isolation stress, sleep deprivation, and pattern recognition in vast featureless landscapes. The human brain creates meaning in monotony, one researcher wrote. To them, the tall whites might have been hallucinations born of sensory deprivation, magnified by Cold War anxiety. Nellis's Secrecy provided the perfect psychological incubator. Endless desert, no outside confirmation, machinery humming beyond comprehension. Skeptics also dissected his consistency as weakness. The story never changed, they argued, because repetition equals rehearsal. Detailed timelines spanning 60 years looked less like memory, more like construction. Yet their analysis often ignored one inconvenient detail. Hall's data logs from 1965 matched environmental readings later declassified from Nellis archives. Numbers aligned precisely, temperatures, wind direction, instrumentation timestamps down to the minute. If he fictionalized, he'd woven imagination seamlessly into authenticated documentation. Supporters seized on that precision. To veteran intelligence analysts, consistency signals truth under pressure. Hall's technical phrasing contained terms unknown outside Air Force vernacular until decades later. That linguistic authenticity persuaded even cautious observers that, whether or not aliens were involved, Hall had worked inside classified parameters. "You can't fake jargon from a world you've never entered," one former range officer remarked. He described procedures that didn't exist publicly until long after his discharge. Still, evidence stayed circumstantial. Investigators seeking photographic proof found nothing undistorted by clearance filters. Every known document relating to range for Harry either redacted the keywords or vanished from archives altogether. Skeptics interpreted that as confirmation of nothing. Believers called it proof of everything. The paradox fueled debate rooms for decades. Absence of evidence versus evidence of deliberate absence. Journalists who approached Hall discovered a man neither evangelist nor recluse. He answered questions like a technician, not a visionary, flat effect, modest tone, no grand claims of salvation. That demeanor swayed some doubters. "Most fantasists crave attention," noted one documentary producer. Hall looks uncomfortable getting it. The quiet made his narrative persuasive in unexpected ways. Conviction replaced urgency. Academic UFO researchers admired his structure but urged caution. They pointed out that Cold War secrecy birthed countless rumors mixing experimental aircraft with extraterrestrial lore. Area 51, Tonopah, Groom Lake, all produced shapes in the night sky before public acknowledgement of stealth craft. "We mistake innovation for intrusion," said aerospace historian Robert Keating. Yet even Keating admitted certain motions, gravity-defying pivots, dead-silent acceleration, remained unmatched by any declassified plane. "Maybe he saw prototypes," he conceded. "Or maybe prototypes came after what he saw." Among military personnel, responses split along generations. Older veterans who'd served near restricted ranges nodded knowingly when asked about odd nights. None confirmed aliens outright, but phrases like foreign visitors surfaced often. Younger officers, trained in post-disclosure language, treated Hall's accounts as cultural artifacts, interesting folklore reflecting earlier decades' secrecy. Yet when pressed about contemporary equivalents, they deferred to protocol. One simply said, "Operational continuity forbids speculation." Same wording, 50 years apart, same silence behind it. Inside UFO discourse, Hall became a cult figure without wanting to be one. Conferences quoted his embassy dessert analogy. Bloggers called him the first diplomat of the unknown. Others weaponized his credibility to validate broader conspiracies about hybrid programs or underground cities. He disavowed those links, insisting he spoke only of what he'd witnessed. If imagination fills the blanks, he told one interviewer, blame Secrecy, not me. Critics countered that his humility masked awareness of myth-making. The more cautious he sounded, the more others projected importance onto him, a feedback loop of credibility. They reminded audiences how memory can ossify into narrative over decades. Neurologists comparing early interviews with later ones noted microvariations, slight shifts in phrasing, timing of events, ordinary for age but ammunition for debunkers. Yet his emotional tone never wavered, curiosity above fear, wonder above certainty. That effective stability itself became a data point for supporters arguing authenticity. Evidence of parallel corroboration complicated things further. Independent base employees from the same years recalled restricted valleys and guest protocols. None used the name Tall White, but their descriptions, height, luminosity, diplomatic etiquette, overlapped with Hall's. When cross-checked, timelines synchronized within weeks. Skeptics suggested contagion of rumor, isolated communities sharing lore until it hardened into shared memory. Supporters saw multiple witnesses confirming the same classified truth through different lenses. Debate intensified when Hall's story resurfaced amid modern UAP hearings. Lawmakers quoted Navy pilot accounts echoing hallmark traits of his scout craft, smooth white exteriors, inertia-defying motion. Journalists drew lines back to Range 4, framing Hall as prophetic whistleblower decades ahead of official recognition. Scientists protested the comparison, insisting correlation isn't causation. But among disclosure advocates, it felt like vindication. Each government acknowledgement of unknown aerial objects reinforced the possibility that Hall's visitors represented an early chapter of the same saga. Emotionally, the discussion often turned from logic to identity. Believers found meaning in the idea of quiet coexistence. Skeptics guarded rational order. Hall's narrative became proxy ground for a deeper cultural divide between those satisfied with uncertainty and those demanding proof. Belief is easy, one physicist argued on a panel. Understanding costs evidence. Yet another attendee replied softly, evidence sometimes costs belief. The tension in that exchange captured the dilemma perfectly. Within academic circles, reevaluations emerged. Sociologists labeled the Tall White story a living myth of collaboration, reflecting society's ambivalence towards secrecy and progress. Philosophers likened it to postmodern folklore, an allegory about knowledge brokered by unseen powers. Such analyses neither confirmed nor denied aliens. They simply affirmed the narrative's endurance as a vessel for mistrust and wonder alike. Hall, inadvertently, had become case study and metaphor simultaneously. For every rational dismissal, another curious professional resurfaced to question the certainty of skepticism itself. Former engineers acknowledged unexplained anomalies in material science timelines. Intelligence historians admitted entire defense programs remained sealed past declassification thresholds. The tall shadows in Hall's desert might symbolize those hidden histories, advanced projects mistaken for beings, or beings mistaken for projects. Either reading preserved mystery as connective tissue. Hall watched these arguments unfold without bitterness. Everyone's right within their pieces, he told a symposium organizer. The skeptics guard reason, the believers guard possibility. Both keep us from falling asleep. His statement reframed debate not as conflict, but as necessary polarity, a dialogue ensuring the story stayed alive without collapsing into dogma. Supporters found renewed purpose in that humility, launching analyses cross-referencing Hall's meteorological notes with modern physics theories about light manipulation. A few physicists, even skeptics, admitted his conjectures anticipated early photonics research. While coincidence remained the rational explanation, admiration replaced ridicule. Hall's technical curiosity became bridge between camps, a reminder that skepticism and wonder can coexist without one canceling the other. By the 202s, online communities divided less along belief lines and more by approach, one side cataloging data inconsistencies, the other tracing symbolic meaning. Both found value. Critics sharpened methodology, believers maintained curiosity. Even debunkers conceded the narrative's endurance proved something sociologically real. Stories this stable survive because they satisfy deeper human equations: fear of isolation, longing for oversight, the comfort of thinking someone wiser watches over the chaos. Hall's skeptics keep the legend grounded, his supporters keep it breathing. Together they form the paradox, sustaining interest into another century. The controversy itself has become part of the evidence, a phenomenon that refuses to vanish under scrutiny. Yet, after all the denials, the patterns didn't disappear, they grew. Section 9. Linking the past to the present. By the time congressional hearings reopened national curiosity about UFOs, Charles Hall's testimony had already aged into legend. Most of the men he'd served with were gone, but their jargon, phrases like protocol accommodation and foreign visitors, had quietly resurfaced inside new briefings under different acronyms. It was as if bureaucratic fossils were animating again, carrying their original DNA under fresh terminology. Hall read transcripts of test pilots describing tic-tac craft that accelerated without sound, and he could almost hear the hum that once filled the Nevada nights. In public, officials called these events unidentified aerial phenomena. To Hall, that careful neutrality was familiar camouflage, the same tone commanders used when dismissing glowing silhouettes as meteorological interference. The language of denial hadn't changed, only evolved into a modern dialect. Each euphemism protected something older than any agency acronym could reveal. Nellis remained at the epicenter, still fenced, still off-limits, still humming beneath classified air. Researchers revisiting archived flight logs found something eerie. Flight restrictions around range for matched modern no-fly sectors, established for drone testing. The coordinates overlapped with areas where Hall claimed the tallwhites maintained underground shelters. Thermal images showed periodic bursts of heat signature unconnected to scheduled exercises. Every few weeks, the pattern repeated like heartbeat intervals. To scientists, those pulses represented geothermal variants. To others, they marked continuity, a decades-long respiration of alien machinery buried under desert crust. Across forums and documentaries, analysts stitched timelines together. 1965, Hall's first encounter. 198's, stealth fighter development. 2004, tic-tac intercepts. 2021, Pentagon confirms ongoing anomalies. Between those signposts ran a single connective thread, technology evolving in discrete leaps echoing the rhythm of hidden collaboration. Even skeptics conceded the symmetry, unsettled coincidence. History doesn't rhyme this perfectly without rehearsal, one historian remarked. Military infrastructure offered quieter proof. Satellite photography revealed new hangars at Nellis built to irregular dimensions. Entryways twice normal height, ventilation shafts proportioned for 16-foot clearance. Engineers called it speculative expansion for cargo drones. Yet the design coincidentally suited the physiology of beings Hall described. Inside Secrecy, coincidence often behaves like confession. Hall, in his late 80s, watched these developments from a quiet home in Las Vegas. He rarely granted interviews anymore, but when he did, reporters sensed restrained amusement. When asked whether he believed the tallwhites still operated in Nevada, he replied simply, "If they ever left, you'd notice the silence." That statement rippled through podcasts and think tanks. Silence as symptom, a paradox too subtle for propaganda. Younger researchers built digital overlays combining declassified maps with Hall's hand-drawn charts. The alignment was uncanny. Modern range boundaries mirrored his 190 SAXS safe lanes. National security analysts tried to dismiss it as cartographic inheritance, yet the persistence implied ongoing protection of specific topography. Whatever the government tested, there still required isolation identical to what once shielded extraterrestrial diplomatic corridors. Government continuity tends to preserve whatever works. Meanwhile, disclosure proponents highlighted cultural echo. Just as Hall's accounts prepared insiders for unannounced visitors, recent official statements conditioned the public for ambiguity. When investigators asked him if he thought transparency was finally beginning, Hall shook his head. "They're not revealing, they're rehearsing." By they, he seemed to reference both institutions and entities, conspirators and caution, teaching humanity how to absorb partial truth without panic. Modern whistleblowers occasionally strengthened his position inadvertently. In 2023, a defense contractor testified to Congress that recovered non-human craft had been reverse-engineered since the Cold War. Though he cited no race names, his description of pale, tall technicians overseeing retrievals triggered immediate association online. Analysts cross-referenced that language with Hall's early terminology, engineers of light, and drew parallels too uncanny to ignore. Official sources neither confirmed nor denied the link, defaulting again to bureaucratic silence. Technology itself seemed to mimic the mysteries. Quantum propulsion prototypes, announced softly through defense patents, invoked photon pressure differentials, identical to Hall's speculative photon theory. Patent authors credited independent research, yet their equations mirrored his handwritten notes nearly phrase for phrase. When journalists pressed the inventors about influences, they claimed convergence, ideas appearing simultaneously in isolation. Hall had once said the same thing standing outside his shack: discovery and contact share language. Even global events hinted at invisible hands. Satellite networks observed sudden atmospheric corridors, columns of ionized particles, forming briefly over remote deserts before dissipating. Governments labeled them auroral anomalies. Hall's supporters called them travel lanes. Each report rekindled the same debate: science or signal, pattern or paranoia. The argument itself ensured the myth endured. As Hall aged into mythic witness, counter-narratives appeared to protect official versions. Debunking articles revisited his early diaries, highlighting minor inconsistencies, subtly reframing him from whistleblower to creative memoirist. Yet the more academics attempted to recontextualize his experience, the more new data emerged aligning with his impossible geography. One investigative podcast exposed procurement budgets referencing Extra-Atmospheric Materials Evaluation Program, housed within Nellis sub-branches. Another uncovered contracts for non-participant environmental consultants. Each sanitized phrase smelled faintly of the same truth Hall had hinted at under different stars. Physicists, no longer dismissive but cautiously intrigued, began parsing his metaphors as models rather than fantasies. Telepathic communication became field-coupled cognition. Levitation suits reframed as photonic actuation exoskins. In adapting his language to engineering vocabulary, academia unwillingly vindicated him. Even skepticism functioned as validation when it mirrored descriptions too precisely to invent anew. Amid renewed attention, an idea took hold. Maybe the old desert experiment never ended. It simply scaled. The tall whites, once handfuls of envoys studying a single airman, might now monitor whole infrastructures from within classified research programs. Their visibility shrank as their influence expanded, a perfect adaptation for observers learning subtlety from human secrecy. The tallest mystery had learned to crouch behind bureaucracy. Hall wrote little in his final years, but one unpublished note captured evolution of thought. "We learned containment from them," he scribbled. "They learned patience from us. The result is equilibrium disguised as progress." That phrase condensed generations of speculation into a single equation of mutual influence. Humanity adopted alien discretion. Aliens adopted human endurance. The partnership matured into silence indistinguishable from independence. Every decade, disclosure promises cycle through headlines, each revealing a little more but never conclusion. And through every cycle, patterns attributed to the tall white's pulse faintly beneath. Lightweight metamaterials, gravity-defying trials, sudden security zones, echoes of experiments too ancient to declassify. Each signpost whispers that transformation continues quietly beneath ordinary time. For believers, that persistence confirms a reality hiding in plain sight. The visitors never departed because their agenda was never complete. For skeptics, it proves the durability of myth, that stories survive by adapting to fresh evidence. Either perspective leaves curiosity intact, which may be the real endgame. Hall himself had said, "They wanted to know if our wonder could outlive their absence." Standing at his porch before dawn in his final years, he sometimes looked toward the same horizon he'd once patrolled. Locals reported seeing 3 faint white lights above the mountains one April morning, holding formation before fading with sunrise. Pareidolia, perhaps, or one last gesture from old observers acknowledging their students' farewell. So much time has passed, yet the script remains unchanged: silence, shimmer, secrecy, and an invitation to keep asking. Somewhere beyond the restricted ridges, a quiet presence still measures humanity's balance between disbelief and faith, curiosity and fear. So where does that leave us now? What the tall whites might want. In the final years of his life, Charles Hall wrote one last entry in the margin of an old field manual. It was a question disguised as surrender. What do they want? After decades of contact and contemplation, he still hadn't answered it. Maybe that was the point. The tall whites left behind curiosity, not clarity. To this day, their motives shimmer like heat over the dunes, visible yet untouchable. Looking across his notes, one pattern stood out. They never conquered, only coexisted. If domination were their goal, secrecy wouldn't serve it. They operated by patience, not power. Every interaction implied purpose beyond material exchange. Perhaps they wanted observation without interference, a front-row seat to humanity's unfolding story. Sociologists who've studied Hall's accounts often describe the relationship as anthropological colonization, the watchful study of a species at the threshold of self-awareness. Humanity wasn't prey or partner, it was curriculum. Another possibility, whispered among physicists sympathetic to Hall, framed their interest as stewardship. Maybe Earth held value not for resources but resonance, a testing ground for consciousness evolving alongside technology. The visitors might see mortal minds as instruments tuning themselves toward a frequency they already mastered. Slowly raising civilization's pitch, they'd ensure future communication without revealing themselves prematurely. It was mentorship disguised as myth, progress encoded through curiosity. To skeptics, such speculation exposes human vanity. We build cosmic purpose into coincidence because acceptance feels smaller than awe. Yet Hall's story lingers precisely because it balances humility and hope. The tall whites never promised salvation or threatened destruction. They watched, nudging through innovation, letting humans attribute achievements to their own genius. Maybe that restraint is the purest form of teaching, to inspire without credit. Inside Nellis archives, fragments of unclassified memos hint peaceably at continuity. Exchanges yield stable relations, recommend indefinite extension. Those bland words, bureaucratic on the surface, conceal philosophical weight. Indefinite extension sounds less like a treaty and more like trust measured against time. If any message persisted across their long quiet, it might be that endurance itself holds meaning. Stay alive, stay curious, stay ready. Hall believed the visitors sought equilibrium. He noted that fear always preceded revelation, as if emotion were the gatekeeper to knowledge. Each step toward understanding demanded calm. Those endless drills, protocols, and boundaries weren't oppression. They were conditioning exercises teaching self-control under impossible truth. The secret agenda could be psychological readiness, preparing a volatile species to face enormity without collapse. The training succeeded. Society now debates aliens on live television rather than panics. Curiosity replaced hysteria. Perhaps that evolution was the goal all along. Yet darker interpretations persist. Some theorists propose an inverse motive, calibration for eventual intervention. By steering humanity's development, the tall whites ensure compatibility. Our infrastructure, energy systems, and cognitive mappings realign to their design, rendering invasion unnecessary. Integration achieved quietly under the mask of progress. If that fear feels implausible, remember how smoothly secrecy normalizes itself. Generations already accept hidden programs as necessity. A species that consents to mystery becomes easy to guide. Hall avoided that paranoia, preferring metaphysics over menace. He spoke of comparative evolution, not exploitation. They measure patience the way we measure speed, he told one interviewer. And they're waiting to see if we ever catch up. The waiting might be mutual. Perhaps humans, in decoding light and gravity, subconsciously mimic the very beings that once inspired those pursuits. When imitation becomes instinct, teacher and student blur. What they want could be reflection, a mirror strong enough to recognize them without fear. Every sighting, every leak, every technological leap draws humanity closer to acknowledging its own potential for mystery. Whether aliens exist matters less than maintaining the capacity to wonder. That sentiment defined Hall's tone until his last breath. He'd turned extraterrestrial testimony into meditation on perception itself. Even skeptics admit his philosophy transcends literal belief. The unknown keeps civilization truthful, forcing humility amid certainty. Walk the Nellis perimeters today, and the air still hums faintly between static and song. Scientists call it electromagnetic resonance. Storytellers call it memory. Either way, something endures. The base lights flicker against the same dunes where Hall once stood clutching his clipboard, feeling smaller than the silence that surrounded him. He'd later write that awe, not terror, defined that night, that he'd sense benevolence mixed with unfathomable scale, like standing beside the ocean for the first time. Maybe that sensation was the message. Coexistence through scale, cooperation through acknowledgement of limitation. Those who followed in his footsteps, pilots, engineers, civilians, inherit that same duality. Each documented anomaly challenges arrogance. Each denial safeguards normalcy. Somewhere between belief and skepticism lies balance, the emotional space Hall called permission to imagine. From that permission springs innovation, faith, and the unending pursuit of meaning. The tallwhites, real or symbolic, ignited that balance by refusing closure. In doing so, they became mirrors for civilization's unfolding curiosity. So what do they want? Maybe only to be questioned eternally, to exist as the mystery that keeps humanity from complacency. There's a Z. Presence measured not in conquest but contemplation, a quiet science of influence keeping our eyes lifted from screens toward skies. Hall understood before anyone else, mystery is method. Without questions, progress halts. With them, it continues indefinitely. Perhaps somewhere beyond those guarded ridges, they still walk under the pale wash of the moon, observing how we respond to the silence they crafted. Perhaps they've already moved on, confident their experiment achieved momentum on its own. Either way, the outcome is identical. Curiosity survives. That's what they wanted, a species addicted to inquiry, forever decoding echoes in the dark. Maybe they've been guiding us all along, or maybe we've been guiding ourselves. If you've made it this far into the mystery, carry that curiosity forward. We're already preparing the next investigation into the evolution of these secret programs, tracing how the oldest silence in Nevada became the language of our future skies. Subscribe and stay alert for the next transmission. The desert still hums, and some questions never sleep.